Our focus. Welcome again. And this week, our focus is on stakeholders, engagement, and management. So I really want to welcome everyone. For those who are just joining for the first time, welcome to the NGO Masterclass. My name is Vincent Egoro, and I'm an organizational development specialist and a project manager. So the NGO Masterclass is a platform where we provide free capacity building tools and resources every week on Saturdays via Zoom, just to be able to strengthen each other in critical areas that we need within the sector. And today we're looking at stakeholder management. So stakeholder is, as we all know, that stakeholders are very, very important to the work that we do, in managing projects. And truly, this sector perhaps may be the only sector where managing stakeholders is something that is very critical to the success of our projects. And through this training, we're going to be presenting you with a series of definitions, concepts, and principles for stakeholder engagement that you can use in your projects, whether you're into humanitarian or emergencies, or whether you're into development, you're into agri, health, you name it. And we're also going to be looking at some approaches to stakeholder engagement that you can use within each of the phases of project management. So throughout the project lifecycle, there are things that you need to do. There are things that you need to do during the project identification and design. There are things that you need to do during project planning. There are things that you have to do during project implementation. But just before we go ahead, please, just to check if you can hear me, can you just type yes? If you can hear me, just to confirm that you can hear me before I go ahead, please. If you can hear me, just type yes, please. All right. Thank you for the confirmation. Thank you. Thank you so very much for the confirmation. Okay, so I'd like to find out from you, who is a stakeholder? You can just type your answer on the chat and I'm going to look at it. Who is a stakeholder? Within the sector, we always talk about our stakeholders. And then we say we're having stakeholder meeting, or we're doing stakeholder engagement. Who is a stakeholder? Is there anybody who would like to just try? You can just type the answers. You can type your response if you want to share. Who is a stakeholder? I'd like to find out from us, what's our understanding of a stakeholder? Thank you so much, Madam Miriam. Someone who is interested, who is concerned, thank you. Any other perspective? Who is a stakeholder? Who is a stakeholder? In our projects, we always talk about stakeholders. These are our stakeholders. Who would you consider as a stakeholder in the context of NGO project management? Any other response, please? Is this only one person? Please, there are no wrong answers in this training. Thank you, Augustine. Someone who has a stake in the work. Thank you, beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Hanatu, anyone who shares in your vision, thank you. Abimbola says, someone who is one way or the other involved and affected by the proposed project. A stakeholder or are people with opinion in the community. Emeni says, anybody who is directly or indirectly involved in the project. Okay, great, great. Thank you so much for the responses, Christiana. A stakeholder is someone who has something to contribute to the progress of the project. Shei, a stakeholder is anyone who is involved in the project, either as a beneficiary or donor and the community. Fantastic. Festus, a person who with an interest or concern in something, especially a business. Fantastic. Thank you all so very much for those responses. Okay, Esther says stakeholders are implementers, beneficiaries, donors of a project or program. Fantastic. Now, you're all very correct, and I appreciate all the responses. Anyone who is a duty bearer, fantastic. All right, so my own definition says a stakeholder is any individual, community, group, or organization with an interest in the outcome of a project, either as a result of being affected by it positively or negatively, or by being able to influence the activity in a positive or negative way. So a stakeholder is somebody, let's say, who has a stake, is someone or a community or group of persons or an organization that has an interest in the results of your project, either because your project or the work that you're doing is affecting them, or whether that project is affecting them positively or negatively. Or also, there are people who are being or who can influence the activity for you in a positive or negative way. So stakeholders are always affected, or they are interested either positively or negatively in your project. Now, there are three main types of stakeholders within the international development or within the NGO sector. We have what we call key stakeholders. And we say here that the key stakeholders are people who can significantly influence, or people who are important to the success of an activity. Those are your key stakeholders. So sometimes you may have government agencies. They can be your key stakeholders. Maybe you want government to give you permits for an activity. You want them to approve something for you. You have partners, CBOs, other CBOs that you're working with in the community, maybe in a cluster. Those are your key stakeholders. And so it's very important to realize that the key stakeholders are also very, very important as well. Now, you would also have what we call primary stakeholders. So these are the individuals or groups who are ultimately affected by an activity. So they can be your beneficiaries, okay? The affected population, people who are going to benefit from the project directly, people who you are carrying the activity for, and people who you are going to deliver the results for. They are the beneficiaries on the project. Or they could also be these beneficiaries, people who may be adversely impacted as a result of that project being carried out. They are primary stakeholders. For instance, you're working on a project that is trying to stop drug abuse in the community. So the beneficiaries are going to be youths and then or persons who are into drugs. And then these beneficiaries are going to be the people who are selling the drugs. So you're going to stop their businesses. So they are going to be adversely affected by the project. Now, in this example that you have on the screen, we say that, for instance, in a rural roads activity, primary stakeholders might include both the petty traders and small farmers whose livelihoods are positively affected by the new roads, and those households who are adversely affected, such as by having to relocate because of road widening. So if you understand this, you look at every time government is trying to create a road, there are some buildings, there are some economic trees, that they are just going to mark X, and then they want to use a bulldozer to bring it down. So those persons are going to be adversely affected. People whose buildings are going to be destroyed because of the road are going to be adversely affected. But people, maybe the communities themselves, or farmers and marketers, or business people who would require that road to increase access to market for their goods and services, those ones are going to be positively affected by the projects that you're carrying out. And then you also have secondary stakeholders. So we say secondary stakeholders are all other individuals or institutions with a stake, interest, or intermediary role in the activity. Okay, so sometimes you have a situation whereby your your key stakeholder can also be a secondary stakeholder on that particular project that you're working on. So it's very important that you realize that. Now, stakeholder engagement is a term that we use almost every day in our work. But stakeholder engagement is a term, when we say we're doing stakeholder engagement, it means that you're carrying out a range of activities and interactions over the life of a project. And there are 8 components of stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement involves 8 components. The first one you have there is stakeholder identification and analysis. So here, you're investing time in identifying and prioritizing stakeholders, as well as assessing their interests and concerns. And then you also have information disclosure. So here, you're communicating information to stakeholders early in the decision-making process in ways that are going to be meaningful and accessible to them. And you have to continue this communication throughout the life of the project. The next component that we have there is stakeholder consultation. So you need to plan out, how am I going to consult with these stakeholders? How am I going to ensure that I carry everyone along? Everyone, today we're talking about inclusion. How am I going to ensure that I include all the groups and the vulnerable persons within the communities? How am I going to keep following up with these persons, groups, or institutions in this project that I'm working on? And then the next one that we are going to look at is called negotiation and partnerships. So there are times where you are going to have some challenges in the project. So you will need to know how to negotiate, how to satisfy the interest of all the stakeholders that you have identified, and how you're going to mitigate when challenges come up, and are experienced by the various stakeholders. The other component of stakeholder engagement involves grievance management. So here, you're going to be able to establish accessible and responsive means for stakeholders to raise their concerns. Okay, so you're going to have what we call complaints and feedback or complaints response mechanisms, whereby stakeholders are able to share with you the challenges that they are facing on that project, and you now be able to respond. And we have the sixth one there is stakeholder involvement in project monitoring. So we are saying that it's always important to involve people who are directly affected in the project. You know, it's good that you also involve the participants or the beneficiaries in monitoring project impacts and benefits, okay? And also, it's also good for you to involve external stakeholders like maybe consultants or external monitors, okay? So that there's going to be credibility and transparency in your project. And then the seventh component that we're going to look at is on reporting to stakeholders. So how do you ensure that you report back to stakeholders on issues, even both the ones that you've consulted and those who have general interest in your project? You should be able to report. There has to be a mechanism or a forum where you're going to ensure that stakeholders get to be informed at key stages about what is going on that project. And the last thing that we're going to look at when managing projects, when doing stakeholder engagement, is going to be management functions. So here you are going to be able to build and maintain sufficient capacity within your organization to manage processes of stakeholder engagement, to track commitments and report on progress. So you see that stakeholder engagement is beyond stakeholder analysis, because for many of us, when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we always want to look at how do we identify stakeholders, and then how do we analyze the stakeholders, their interests and all that. But for you to do a proper holistic engagement of your stakeholders, you have to carry out these 8 components. You must do stakeholder identification analysis. You have to plan around how you're going to be disclosing information. You're going to know about how to consult with your stakeholders. How do you build partnerships? How do you ensure that you're able to negotiate, soundly? And how would you manage grievances between stakeholders? How would you involve stakeholders in project monitoring? How would you set up reporting mechanisms whereby you are able to report to stakeholders and provide feedback about things that are going on the project? And how would you build capacities within your organization to manage the process of stakeholder engagement? So we are going to be going into each of these phases in detail, and I just hope that we are able to cover significantly within the time that we have. But if we don't, wherever we stop, we're going to now wrap it up with another session on this. So now let's focus on stakeholder identification and analysis. Please, if you have a question or there's something you want to ask, you have a comment, you have observation, you can raise your hand, or you can just type the question in the chat box and I will recognize you and attend to it. Please. Thank you. So we said that stakeholder identification and analysis is a very first step in stakeholder engagement. Now, it's important that the first thing that you're going to be doing is to identify your stakeholders. Whenever you're starting a project, there are going to be some predetermined stakeholders. For instance, for those of you in health, you may already have predetermined stakeholders in terms of institutions or offices or individuals who are going to give you approvals, people whom you must consult, even in the design of those projects. If not, the projects are not going to go forward. But after the project has been designed and you want to start it, there are going to be stakeholders that you need to first of all identify. And so it's very important that you identify all your stakeholders by listing them. Who are the people who have some level of interest in the things that we're doing? Who are the people who are affected by our project activities or by the problems that we're trying to solve? Who are the people who are causing the problems we're trying to solve, and so on? So stakeholder identification is very, very critical. And once you've done your stakeholder identification, the next thing that you want to do is the stakeholder analysis. So the stakeholder analysis will give you an in-depth look at the stakeholder interests, how they will be affected, and to what degree and what influence can these people have on your project. So you need to understand that, okay? By doing the stakeholder analysis, you will be able to know the interests of all stakeholders who may affect or be affected by your project. You would also be able to tell if there are going to be potential conflicts and risks that could jeopardize your project. By doing the stakeholder analysis, you'll be able to identify opportunities and relationships that you can build upon when implementing your project, and so that you become successful. Because the truth is that it is people that make projects fail or succeed. And managing your project, your stakeholders effectively is a very big step in ensuring that that project is successful. So you will be able to, by carrying out a stakeholder analysis, you'll be able to identify groups that you can encourage to participate in different stages of the project cycle. Because there are some people who are going to be involved in your project early on, maybe at the very beginning, at the design stage. There are going to be some stakeholders who are going to be involved, at the later stages, maybe during planning or during implementation, or even during evaluation of the project. So it's important that you begin to think about these early on in your project. And then you also need to be able to identify the ways how you can improve the project, okay? And ensure that you are able to reduce or remove totally every negative impact on people and groups that are vulnerable within that community where you're working in. And so stakeholder identification and analysis is very, very critical, okay? Now, to do a proper stakeholder and analysis, there are tools. There are tools that you will need to use. But first of all, before we look at the tools, when are you going to conduct a stakeholder analysis? One, you conduct a stakeholder analysis during the identification stage of a project. Okay, at that period, when you are conceiving the project ideas, it is very important that you think about who the stakeholders are going to be. You want to identify the important and influential stakeholders, and you also need to decide how are we going to involve these people in our project? How are we going to involve the chiefs? How are we going to involve politicians? How are we going to involve youths? How are we going to involve the various women groups that we have on the project? Another stage where you should involve stakeholders is also during the design and appraisal stage of the project. So this will help you to ensure that the project is well designed, that the proposal that you're writing is going to be a sound proposal. So even within your organization, you have internal stakeholders. So how are you going to bring them in? How are you going to ensure that they participate in your project activities, especially around where you're writing proposal? How can you ensure that your stakeholders, the technical leads, and other people who have one or two things to add to make that project design strong, how do you ensure that they work? It's very important that you identify them early and bring them on board. So you also need to conduct a stakeholder analysis at the inception stage of the project. So here, you'll be planning. At the inception stage is where you're developing your work plans, your implementation plans, your project budget, and so on. So at this stage, you're going to plan, how are we going to involve the different stakeholders when we are starting this project? Who are the various stakeholders that we need to involve? And then how are we going to bring them in? For instance, maybe you're trying to do a project launch and you want a state government official or someone from the presidency to come and be around. So it's at the planning stage that you're, or the inception stage, that you're going to be thinking about, how do we bring these individuals, these politicians, how do we bring them to become part of our activity? So it's very important. You're also going to be doing stakeholder analysis at the implementation stage of the project. So here, you want to ensure the full participation of key stakeholders, okay, that are going to support your project. And you also need to be able to monitor the key stakeholders who are opposed to your project. Because for every project activity, you're going to have people who are in support and people who are against. So no matter how successful, no matter how important you think that project is, you're still going to have people who do not like it. You're still going to have people who will not be for it. So at this stage, it's very, very important that you begin to carry out a stakeholder analysis. Okay, I think we have a message. Okay. Adiola, I don't get you. Are you asking what is stakeholder analysis? Okay. All right. Okay, so we say that stakeholder analysis is the process stakeholder analysis is a process that is used in managing your project to help you identify the interests of all the stakeholders who may affect or be affected by a project. Okay, stakeholder analysis is a process whereby you're using to identify the interest of stakeholders who may affect or who may be affected by your project. So for every project that you have, there are people who are affected by it, and there are people also who may be able to affect it. So it's very, very important that you think about that. So who are the people who are going to be affected by our project? It allows you to identify the interests of the different groups and individuals and institutions who are affected or who may affect your project, and also find ways of ensuring that you get the support of those who are in favor of the activity, and also manage the risks posed by people who are against it. So stakeholder analysis is used when you're managing development project, especially when you're managing NGO project. It's a methodology or a process that helps you to identify people or groups or institutions or organizations who may affect or who can be affected by your project. And also, you now think about how can we get these people's support, the people who are supporting us or who have a positive influence on our project, how can we get their support? And the people who do not have a positive influence, who have a negative influence on our project, how can we ensure that we bring strategies in place to ensure that their attitudes or their actions do not derail our project? So it's always an integral part of project design. You cannot do project design without thinking about stakeholder engagement, because you will need to identify the people who you're going to be planning this project for. And it is this process that we're entering that will help you to identify those individuals, either the women, the children, the boys and girls that you're targeting on the project directly, or the people who you're not targeting directly, but who you need their support, or who you need to involve in the project at key stages if you're ever going to achieve your project objectives. So we said you need to conduct stakeholder analysis at the inception stage. You need to conduct the stakeholder analysis at implementation stage. And you also need to conduct a stakeholder analysis during the evaluation. So here, whenever an evaluation is carried out at the end of the project, before you close out a project, you still need to involve people. And even when you're carrying out an evaluation, you're going to be involving people, either as individuals or as groups or as institutions, who are going to be there to help you drive the process of closing out your project. So it's very important. It's very important that you understand how stakeholder analysis is done, because it's useful throughout the entire project cycle. But you start the analysis around the identification and design stage, and then when you're planning, you now begin to develop your engagement plans and so on, to think about how are we going to engage with these people that we have identified on the project. How can we identify the supporters, and how can we identify the blockers, and what can we do about it? Now, there are many techniques that you would use for stakeholder analysis. But the one that is very common that we always see is what we call the stakeholder analysis workshops. Stakeholder analysis workshops are common because, one, we say that project management is participatory. So you don't want to sit on your own to carry out a stakeholder analysis. You want to involve other people, people within your organization or within the project that you're working in, to help you to identify the various stakeholders who are going to be affected or who can affect your project in a way. So stakeholder analysis workshop is one method or tool that you can use to identify and to also plan for your various stakeholders. Now, for you to carry out or to conduct a stakeholder analysis workshop, you will need a facilitator. So one person is going to be the person who is going to facilitate the process. You will need somebody who is going to moderate, somebody who is going to guide the process. So this can be done internally rather, within your organization, or it can also be done externally outside of your organization. Maybe you want to bring in a consultant to help you facilitate the process. You only need to bring in a consultant when, let's say, the project that you're trying to do is a complex project or is a huge project, and you really want to ensure that you get the best out of the proposal writing or project design stage, and ensure that the information that you're going to get, you've exhausted all options in trying to get everyone who you're going to be working in that project. Or if it's a project that has to do with a consortium or a cluster, you're not the only one who is going to carry it out. You have other partners as well. It's important that you get somebody to facilitate the stakeholder analysis workshop session for you. So if you want, now, how do you carry out a stakeholder analysis workshop? One, the first thing that you need to do is that you need to form working groups. So you're going to divide people into working groups of 4 to 6. So maybe you have all the people from a similar background are going to be in one group. It's always better. People who are in a similar background should be in one group. That way you're able, when they are discussing, the ideas within their context is going to flow, okay? So it's ideal. It's usually ideal if you have people within a particular background. But when you do not have people, many people from a particular background, you can go ahead and mix the audience or the participants of that particular group. So you could have a group of 4 or a group of 5 people, and then that's the first thing that you need to do. And once you've created groups, just like maybe you have a training and then you're doing group activities rather. So you have a training and you're doing group activities, you're going to break. The same thing is going to happen when you're doing stakeholder analysis workshop. You need to create working groups. The next thing that you're going to do is to ensure that the participants understand their roles and why they are carrying out the analysis. So you want to use flip charts. If you're doing it in your office or you're facilitating it, maybe you have the opportunity to facilitate meetings and you want to get people to share what their stakeholders are, you will need flip charts. Okay, so within the first flip chart, people are going to define who and what stakeholders are. So you as the facilitator, you're now going to be able to define who is a stakeholder or what are stakeholders. If it's like an individual, then it's who. If it's an organization or an institution, then you're talking about what the definition of a stakeholder is. And then within the second flip chart, you're now going to share the reason why you are conducting the stakeholder analysis. So you want to use flip charts or you want to use whiteboard markers and place them strategically so that people can read and see and understand the reason why they are actually carrying out the stakeholder analysis. Now, in the third flip chart, so you're going to be using 4 flip charts now. So in the third flip chart, you're going to show the 3 basic steps in undertaking a stakeholder analysis, which is 1, creating a stakeholder table to identify all the stakeholders and what their interests are in the activity. So you want your participants in each group to draw out a table to create what we call a stakeholder table. A stakeholder table will have a column where you talk about each of the stakeholders, and then the next column will talk about the interests of each of the stakeholders. So the next column is going to talk about the interests of all the stakeholders and whether they affect you, they are affected positively or negatively on that project. And after you've identified or created the stakeholder table where you've identified all the stakeholders, the next thing that you're going to have the participants do is identify the influence and importance of each of the stakeholders, and you're going to put them in a matrix. I'm going to show you the matrix, how it works, and then you should be able to identify the risks that may affect the project design, and you also need to talk about how you will be able to deal with these risks. So this also helps you in your risk management. Remember, if you've ever done any project management course with me, I told you that risk management starts early. At the very beginning, when you're designing the project, you're going to be able to identify all the risks on the project. And when you're creating the log frame, the assumption column is where you're going to insert the risks that you have identified on the project. But this topic is not focusing on risks. We are looking at stakeholders. And then in the fourth flip chart, you will need to show how the illustrative or how the stakeholder table should look like. Now, I'm going to come back to, I'm going to explain this again, but let me show you the stakeholder table. But in essence, what I'm saying is that when you're facilitating a stakeholder analysis workshop, you need to, first of all, you need to divide people into groups that are manageable. The group should not be more than 6 people. If not, you'll not be able to manage them. It will be difficult for you to manage them if there are more than 6 people. And then you also now will need to create a first flip chart and define what a stakeholder is or who a stakeholder is, so that the participants will be able to understand the kind of persons, the kind of groups, or the kind of institutions that they should identify in their project. And then the second flip chart should show the reason why you've gathered them. Why are you carrying out the stakeholder analysis? What is the reason? Are you using it for the project design? What is it going to help you do? That would, guide the participants and ensure that the information that they are sharing is quality information. And then the third thing so the third flip chart is going to show you the 3 basic steps in undertaking a stakeholder analysis. One is that you need to create a stakeholder table where you've identified all the stakeholders. You also identify their interest in your project. And then the second thing is that you need to identify the influence and importance of each of these stakeholders, where you're going to create a matrix that we call the influence importance matrix. And then the third thing that you need to do is you need to identify the risks. What are the risks associated with this project? How can we mitigate these risks? And so on. So once you've done stage 1 and you've done stage 2, where you've informed the participants about the stakeholder analysis, the next thing that you want to do is to complete the stakeholder table, where you're going to ask the participants to complete the table itself. All right, so the third stage there is participants are able to complete the stakeholder table. But I think it's better I show you the stakeholder table so that you'll be able to understand it. So let me just take you to the stakeholder table and explain it. All right, so this is a stakeholder table. And this is an example of an illustrative stakeholder table that has all the stakeholders are identified in the first column. And then the second column talks about the interest of that stakeholder in the project. And the last column talks about whether that stakeholder has a positive or a negative influence on the project. So if you look at the first stakeholder there, which is small farmers. So we said the small farmers, what's their interest? Their interest is that they want to have a higher output and income. They are small farmers. They want to be able to plant crops. They want to be able to plant crops and harvest those crops and ensure that the crops are yielding well, and they are able to sell the crops and get better incomes. That's their interest. So they have a positive interest on your project. Their interest is very positive. And then you have the food traders, okay? The food traders, their interest is to have more sales, and they have a positive interest in their project. Then you have laborers. Laborers have more jobs, they want to require more jobs, and their interest is a positive one on that particular project. If it's a project, for example, this is a project that is trying to take people away from poverty and increase household incomes. So laborers, they want more jobs, and so that they'll be able to earn more, and they have a positive interest on your project. You also have what we call the money lenders. The money lenders, for them, they feel that if you empower their clients, so maybe the laborers used to go and borrow money from them, or the small farmers used to borrow money from them at a very exorbitant rate. So for them, if you empower the laborers or empower the small traders, then it may mean that they are going to have less business. So they have a negative influence or negative interest on your project. And then you have government officials. Government officials, they want the project to succeed, so they have a positive interest. But also they are also thinking, maybe if these people are empowered and they know their rights, they are going to lose rent. Maybe they used to go to the fields and collect rents from the farmers who are ignorant, maybe in the rural areas. And so if your projects now begin to educate these farmers and inform them and empower them of their rights, the farmers may not be willing to pay the rent again to these government officials. All right. So once you develop a table like this during the stakeholder analysis stage, it helps you to identify all the stakeholders. The stakeholder tables helps you to identify all the stakeholders who are affected or who can affect the project, and also helps you to identify their interests. So you need to look at each of these stakeholders and think about what is their interest on this project. What is their interest on this project, and how can we work with them? And then, is this interest a positive one or a negative one? So is this interest a positive one or a So it's a very simple tool. It's not as complex as a stakeholder analysis matrix. This is a very simple tool that you start with to analyze or identify all the stakeholders that you have on your project. So you want to know these stakeholders, what are their interests, and is this interest, is it positive or is it negative that we have? So let's go back to what I was talking about. I just needed to show you the stakeholder table so that you'll be able to properly understand it, and as I explain how it works. So in order for you to draw up a stakeholder table, you want to first of all identify and list all potential stakeholders on one column. And then you want to identify their interests. Some of these interests may be open, some of them may be hidden interests. So you want to identify their interests in relation to the problems that your project is addressing. Okay? So what are the interests that these stakeholders have? And how can we work with them to address it? So it's very important for you to know that if you don't know the stakeholders' interests, you'll not be able to work with them properly. And it's also important to note that some stakeholders may have more than one interest. Like in that example that I showed you, the government officials, they have a positive interest and they also have a negative interest also. They are concerned about losing their rents, even though they want the project to succeed. They are also concerned about losing income that they get. And then you also briefly assess, after you've identified the interest, you want to assess the likely impact of the project on each of these interests. Is this interest, is it positive? If it's positive, then it's going to impact our project positively. Is it a negative interest? If it's negative, then it's going to affect our projects negatively. And then where you do not know whether it is positive or negative, you can now say, okay, the interest is unknown. You don't know whether this is positive or you don't know if it is negative on that particular project that you're working on. And then by doing the stakeholder tables, you'll be able to indicate the relative priority which your project should give each stakeholder in meeting their interests. Because one, if you don't identify all the stakeholders this way, you're going to leave out on some important stakeholders. Even though we agree that you cannot meet every stakeholder's interest on that project, but there are going to be some stakeholders whose interests need to be met at the early stage, maybe at the design stage, and there are going to be stakeholders whom you have to meet their interests maybe at the inception stage or the implementation stage, and there are going to be stakeholders that you have to attend to at the evaluation stage, at the end of the project. But if you don't identify them like this and you don't use a table, you don't create a table to really look at each of these stakeholders with your team, and that's why we said you do a stakeholder analysis workshop. You're brainstorming with your team to find out this stakeholder, is it really important stakeholder? Okay, what is their interest and how is it going to affect our project? Is it positively or is it negatively? That will help you to develop the strategies that you are going to use. If it's positive, how can we bring them closer? If it's negative, what are the risks and what can we do in the project to ensure that either we turn their negative influence into positive or we avoid them totally on that project that we are working on. Now, okay, so I missed this. Okay. All right, so after carrying out the after conducting the stakeholder table, the next thing that you want to do is called the identifying the influence and importance of each stakeholder. So the fourth thing that you're going to be doing there is stakeholder influence and importance. So we said influence is defined as the power a stakeholder has to facilitate or impede the achievement of a project's objective. Influence, when we say a stakeholder has influence, what we mean is that that stakeholder has power to either facilitate or to stop, either to facilitate or to stop the achievement or to hinder the achievement of your objectives in that project. While importance in project management, importance in stakeholder management is defined as the priority given to satisfying the needs and interests of each stakeholder. So once you have identified the stakeholders and you've known their interests in the stakeholder table, the next thing that you want to do is to create an influence and importance map or an influence and importance table. Here, what you're going to be doing is that you're still going to create a table and you're going to score each of the stakeholders that you've identified. You're using on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the lowest score, whereby when a stakeholder has very little importance or influence, and 4, the stakeholder has very great importance or influence. So you need to rank them from very little to very great importance or influence that they have. So if we go back to our table where we identified some stakeholders in the stakeholder table, this is the stakeholder table that I told you. So these are the stakeholders, and this project is a livelihood project. It's a livelihood project whereby the politicians or government officials may have great influence over the project by facilitating or hindering the allocation of the necessary resources, while the poor people may have very little power to influence the outcome of the project. And at the same time, the government officials may have very little importance as far as the project is concerned, since it is not designed to meet their needs, while the poor people are central and very important to that particular project activity. Okay, Esther, you say why a score of scale of 1 to 5 and not 1 to 10? Is it, yeah, so it's just like when you're doing an evaluation. If you're doing an evaluation, we always advise that you use a 5-point scale. You cannot rank a 10-point scale in an evaluation. This is an evaluation you're doing. So you want to start, maybe you say, okay, you're starting with very poor, fair, good, very good. In terms of maybe you're judging a training facilitation, you say, okay, how will you rate the facilitator based on this? It's a 5-point scale that you use in that regard. You say, okay, very poor, you use poor, fair, good, very good, and so on. So that's what we are trying to replicate here. So in this instance, we're saying that you use a 5-point scale here. Now look at the small farmers. So we say that the small farmers have very high importance, and we have given them 5 because the project is for them. The project is about increasing their livelihood. So they are very important to this project, but their influence is low, and their influence is 2 because they do not have the resources. They don't determine whether they are able to receive the resources or not. They have no influence, but the project is being designed for them, but they don't have any influence to tell you to say, okay, I want to eat this, or I want you to give me this or that. They depend on what is given to them. They look up to the people handing them those resources. So they don't have any influence. Now, the food traders, on the other hand, have a very low importance, but they have a high influence. The project is not for them, but their influence is higher than the influence of the small farmers. The laborers have a high influence. It's a livelihood project. We want to improve their livelihoods. So the laborers have high importance. The project has been designed for them, but their influence is low. They have no influence in determining who gives them job. They can go out and stand and nobody's going to hire them. Now, the money launderers do not have any importance in that project, but they have somewhat high influence because they lend people money, and so They can tell people not to participate in that project. So these people can become your blockers. And the government officials, they do not have any importance on the project, but they have a lot of influence. So in terms of importance, importance are the people or group of people who are going to benefit directly on the project, while the influence is people who can sway public opinion, who can tilt perception about your project either positively or negatively. This importance influence table is similar to the Venn diagram, where we talked about in project management, and you're using circles to determine stakeholders, and the size of the circle shows you the relative power or influence that the stakeholder has. Okay, so when a stakeholder has influence in a Venn diagram, it means that their circle is big. But this is, I thought that this is, we should show something different, because many of you may have been familiar with the Venn diagram. So the importance influence table is a tool that is very easy to do when you want to know the type of influence a stakeholder has and whether that stakeholder is important to your project. Okay, so with this type of analysis, you will know whether it will guide you so that you're not leaving any stakeholder behind on the project. You are ensured that you're carrying every stakeholder along on that project that you're doing. Do we have any questions regarding this? Now, another tool that you can use for stakeholder analysis is called the importance and influence matrix. Okay, so the importance and influence matrix is a follow-on to the importance and influence table that we just did. The importance and influence table, or the importance and influence matrix, I beg your pardon, is a follow-on tool to the importance and influence table. So in the box A, you have people who have high importance and low influence. These are going to be the victims. For instance, you have the laborers and the small farmers. They are going to be in box A. All your beneficiaries, okay? Everybody who is included in box A, box B, and box C are your key stakeholders in your project. They can significantly influence the project activities. But most especially in box A, you're going to have people who have the highest importance on that project, but people who have low importance. And then in box B, you have people who have high importance and high importance and high influence. People who can make a difference on that project. These are the ones you're going to put in box B. And then in box C, you have people who have low importance and high influence. Very low importance and high influence. And then in box D, you may have people who are of low importance and low influence. So the stakeholder importance and influence matrix helps you to allocate, to really look at each of the stakeholders that you've identified, which of them are high importance and high influence. Those are going to be the victims or the beneficiaries of that project. People who are of high importance and low influence. People who cannot influence anything on their own, but they are very key to the success of that project. Or people who you're designing the project for are going to be in box A, while the people who are of high importance and high influence, people who can make a difference are going to be in box C, and then box B. And box C are people who are of low importance and high influence. They are going to be in box C. While box D, you have people who are of low importance and low influence. So that will enable you to now know how you want to prioritize. How would you prioritize the various stakeholders that you have? What activity will you do with each stakeholder? What approach are you going to use based on their level of influence and their level of importance on the project? You can now prioritize how you're going to engage them on that project. You cannot engage all the stakeholders equally in a project. There are going to be people who are going to be more engaged than other people in your project. But if you don't carry out an analysis, you will not be able to determine who to engage and who not to engage in that project. And you may miss out on critical project, critical stakeholders. And you now come to implementation and you now see a lot of opposition, a lot of people fighting you on the project, and they are not giving you the necessary support that you require on that project. Do we have any question? Any question, any comments, any experience using the importance or an influence matrix? Does anybody want to share a perspective? You can just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Okay. Now, there's another tool that is called the participation matrix. The participation matrix. This is a tool that is used to indicate the type of participation by key stakeholders at different stages of the project cycle. And here it uses columns. And so the columns will indicate those who should be informed of your activities and outputs, those who should be consulted when conducting these activities, and those with whom you should work in partnership to achieve the intended results, and people who would have ultimate control for each stage of your activity. Okay, Ololo Samuel said, how do you manage a situation where after this engagement, yet because of the need of the top influencers, they decide to thwart the project? Okay, so we've not started the engagement yet. So what we are doing now is trying to analyze the stakeholders. And remember, I told you that there are 8 components of stakeholder engagement, and stakeholder identification analysis is just the very first. You need to identify the stakeholders and analyze them before you now begin to engage them. And so we are moving on. When we finish all the tools, what I'm sharing now are the tools that you can use to carry out a stakeholder analysis. Once you're done with the analysis, stakeholder analysis, we'll now move on to talk about ways you can engage your stakeholders. In maybe how do you consult with your stakeholders? How do you share information with them? So it's one thing to analyze the stakeholders. It's also another thing to engage them properly when you started implementation. So I think that by the time we begin to look at ways to engage with stakeholders, it may answer that question that you have, Samuel. So another tool that you may want to consider is called the participation matrix. It's a very simple tool that is used to indicate the type of participation by stakeholders. How should they participate? You want to know who should be informed, who should be consulted, who you want to partner with, and who you want to give ultimate control on your project. Now, this is an example of a participation matrix in an emergency project. So the type of participation, the first column talks about the type of participation in the project at various stages of the project. The second column talks about the stakeholder you should inform at each of these engagement activities, who you should consult, who you should partner with, and who you should give ultimate control of that particular, which stakeholder should have ultimate control of this particular activity. So for example, we have here rapid assessment and priority setting. So when you're conducting rapid assessment, you don't need to inform anybody. You don't have to inform anybody. But you may need to consult with your organization staff. Maybe you have colleagues that you want to consult. You also need to consult the community, and you need to consult the authorities. Now, remember that consulting is a two-way communication, that when you consult with somebody, you're speaking to the person or you're sharing information, and the person is also providing you with feedback. So you need to consult your staff, you need to consult with authorities, you need to consult with the community. And then you may need to partner with the donor agency, with NGOs or United Nations agency and the authorities to carry out this rapid assessment. And then you don't need to have anybody take ultimate control of it. The next activity here is project design. So after you have carried out an assessment, you want to design the project, you also do not need to inform anybody, but you need to consult communities, leaders, focus groups, women groups, and so on, because you want their take. You're designing the project for them, so you want them to be involved in it. And then you may do that in partnership with your organization, with other NGOs, with authorities, with the community, and the implementing agency, your organization will need to have ultimate control of the design stage, because you're the one writing the proposal. You don't want the proposal to go and fail. During the implementation, you may need to inform if it's an INGO, you may need to inform your organization headquarters. You also need to inform the donor. You need to consult with community members. You also need to consult with your staff who are going to be implementing the project. And if you have other partners, you may need to consult them. But you may need to have partnerships with other NGOs, your organization, UNHCR, government authorities, and the community members, but you have to take control. Now, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, the same thing, you need to consult your organization, you need to consult the donor, you need to inform the donor, but you may need to consult with authorities, with United Nations, with community, and then partnerships to enter with agency, with the UN, ACR, and you need to take ultimate control of it with your consultants. Now, this example is an emergency project by the UN that I think that has to do with UNHCR, and that's why you're seeing a lot of UNHCR. It's an example of an emergency project, and when you're doing emergency humanitarian projects, you need to involve the United Nations agencies that are sitting in that particular sector or working group where your project is involved in. So when it has to do with livelihood, you need to involve the UNHCR as well, and so that's why UNHCR is popping up here most of the time. So is any question regarding the participation matrix? So it's a very simple tool, as you can see. It's a very simple tool. It's a tool that you can adapt. It's a tool that you can replicate. You just prepare a column for the activity itself, who you want to inform, who you should consult, who is going to be in partnership with you, and who is going to have ultimate control. which of the stakeholders is going to have ultimate control. Now, another tool that you can use is called the power and interest matrix. The power and interest matrix is a tool that is used in assessing the feasibility of a project activity, and it helps you to ensure that you focus on how the activity is going to empower or reduce the power of different stakeholders. Okay? The power and interest matrix helps you to assess the feasibility of an activity, and it also ensures that your team focuses on how that activity or that project will try to empower or reduce the power of different stakeholders. And in formulating the matrix, the power of key stakeholders to facilitate or impede the project is assessed. And now you're also going to be using, in terms of power, you're going to be using from 1 to 5, where 1 is equals to little power and 5 is equals to great power. So you're going to assess the power of key stakeholders. Do they have the power to help you achieve this objective, or do they have the power to hinder your project activities? On a scale of 1 to 5, what is their level of power? And then you're also going to look at their interest. You're going to look at the interest of the stakeholder in the success or failure of your project. If they are interested in your failure, you're going to rank them in -2. And if they are interested in the success of the project, you rank them in +2. Now, that is one way, one method of carrying out the power and interest matrix. There are other methods as well. Another method would say that you need to prioritize the stakeholders according to those who have the power and those who can influence your intervention and those who have an interest in your intervention. So when you have high power and high interest people, these are people that you need to fully engage with, and these are people you make strong effort to satisfy. And when you have people who have high power and less interest, these will be people who you should satisfy, but not to the extent that they become bored with your message. And then you have people who have low power but high interest. These are people who you need to keep them informed, to talk to them from time to time, and ensure that if any issues come up, you need to inform them about the problems that you're having if there are any issues, because these people can be very helpful, especially when they have the details of your interventions. And then you have the people who are low power and less interest people. Low power, low interest. These are people you just keep in contact, but you do not have to communicate with them often. So I'm going to show you the various ways to carry out the power and interest matrix. So here is one example. This example is the one that I'm just informing you. So you have people who you should keep satisfied, people who you should manage closely, people who you should monitor, and people who you should keep informed. The people who you should keep satisfied are people who have high power and high interest. These are the people who you should keep satisfied. People who have high power and high interest. Sorry. So the people we should manage closely are the people who have high power and high interest, because the power matrix goes to the right. So people on this area are people who have high power and high interest, and then People who have high power and less interest, then you just need to be able to satisfy them. And then people who have low power and low interest, low power and high interest people, you need to keep them informed. And then people who have low power and low interest, you just need to just monitor them, but you don't need to apply much effort in that. Now, there is also another method of carrying out the stakeholder analysis, the power and interest matrix, which I just talked about here, where you talk about the ranking, where you talk about people from little power and people of great power. People with little power, you give them 1. People of great power, you rank them with 5. People of great interest in failure, you score them -2. And people of high interest or great interest in success, you score them with the +2. So let's look at that. Now, this is an example from, I just lifted this off a DFID, guide that I saw. It's an example from, it's online there. It's from the DFID. That example is from a DFID project. So the DFID project was used for that particular example that you're looking at now. So as you can see, I don't know if it's bold enough. So you have on the one side, people below 0 are people who have great interest in your failure or interest in your failure. And then people who are in +2 above the 0 line are people who have a great interest in your success. And then you now have people, with very little power, who have some power, people who have great power, and people who have very great power are ranked in 5. For instance, under this quadrant, we have here, we have the women. The women are not very powerful, but they have a great interest in the success of the project. So what you want to do is that you want to shift them to the second quadrant to ensure that they have great power because their interest is already great. You're trying to shift these women and the farmers. The farmers have a lot of interest in the success of the project, but they do not have any power in terms of influence. So you want to shift them. You want to shift the farmers by maybe forming them into cooperatives and forming the women also into cooperatives. You want to be able to shift them into the next quadrant whereby they will have a great power and great positive interest in your project. But people who are in the below the 0 line here, in the lower quadrant, these poppy lancers and poppy farmers, they don't have any interest. They don't have any interest in the project. So what you want to do is, how can we make these people interested in our project? And how can we increase their power? So the essence of the power and interest matrix basically is that you want to look at people who have power and people who have interest. Is it a positive interest and is it a negative interest? And you want to try and develop strategies on how you can change that. If the people do not have power, and these are the real stakeholders or the primary stakeholders or the direct beneficiaries of that project, if you do this type of analysis, you really want to see how can we increase the power of these stakeholders because they don't have power now, but they are very interested. How can we increase their power? That is all what you're trying to do with the power and interest matrix. You're trying to look at shifting power dynamics within the stakeholders. The people who are going to disturb you, how can we remove their power? How can we deflate their power? These people are very powerful. What strategies can we use so that we do not give them that power again in that project? And how can we now empower our supporters, the real people who are very interested in our project, but they do not have power. What strategies can we put in place to ensure that these people become more powerful as a result of the project that we are working with them on? So do we have a question? So another metrics that we need to look at is called the readiness and power matrix. So the readiness and power matrix is used in assessing how ready different stakeholders are to participate in your project and how much power they have. Now, readiness is defined as the amount, or as either the amount a stakeholder knows about the activity, how much information does a stakeholder have, as well as their view of the project, whether it is positive or it is negative. While power is defined as the influence. Power is the influence the stakeholder has over the success of your project. Now, in carrying out or in developing the readiness and power metrics, you're going to be using two things that are very key, which is X and 0. X is the position with which a particular stakeholder is, and 0 is the position with which you may want to move them to. So for instance, you have a particular stakeholder who maybe they have high readiness, but they have low power. And so you want to take them maybe, okay, and say, okay, do I want to increase the power of these stakeholders? So if I move the person from X to 0 in a particular column, it means that this stakeholder is important to me. I want to increase either their influence or I want to increase their readiness. Now let's look at this example. Now, this is the readiness and power matrix example. And the stakeholder we are using here is a senior manager in a particular project, a middle manager in a particular project, a project team member, and a competing middle manager in another project. Now, the readiness, we're ranking them in terms of high readiness, medium readiness, low readiness, and then power is also ranked in terms of high power or influence, medium power influence, and low power or influence. Now, in this example, our senior manager has low readiness, meaning that he doesn't have much information. It is our interest to increase his knowledge about our project because he has a lot of power, but he feels that he doesn't know much about our project. So what we want to do is that we are thinking that we want to inform him more to increase his knowledge about our project. So this is where his readiness is in terms of his degree of knowledge about our project is very low. And so we marked it X here. And so the project is determining that by the end of the project, we want to develop strategies to ensure that we inform him, and then we'll now move his readiness to medium. Now, our middle manager has a lot of information about our project, but his power or influence is not high. So it is in our interest to increase his power or influence because maybe he's our direct supervisor, he's a project manager. So it is our interest to increase this person's power by taking him from medium power to high power. So you are the one who's going to now begin to think about What are the strategies that I can use to increase this person's power on the project? Then we have project team member who is very, very informed. He has high readiness, but he has low power. But we don't want to increase his power. We just want it to remain the way it is. And then we have a competitive middle manager who has low readiness, and he or she has high power. And so the project wants to reduce that person's power by developing strategies, because it is in our interest to reduce the person's power. So in this readiness matrix, it helps you to plan to take certain actions on a project, either in increasing people's power or increasing people's readiness on that project, reducing their readiness or reducing their power on the project. So it just helps you for each of the stakeholders that you've identified. Do you think that this person is having undue influence and power on the project? How can we reduce their power or influence? What are the strategies we can use to reduce them? Or we are not having the support of this individual or group on the project, and they have a lot of power. How can we begin to get their support? By beginning to inform them more about our project. What strategies can we bring to ensure that they stay informed of our project and in the know? And then, yeah. Now, can we have any questions, any comments, any observations? I think our time is running out, so I'd just like to get feedback. Is there any questions, any comments, any observation? Is there any tool? Is there anybody who's had experience in some of these tools that we've talked about here? You can unmute yourself and just speak. Is there anybody who has experience in using some of these tools that we've talked about? How did you use it, or how are you using it in your organization? Or is there any tool that you have found useful? Is there any tool that you found useful in what we've shared so far? These
Hello,
tools
good afternoon.
are practically very simple tools. Yeah, please go ahead, please. Thank you.
Just to say that actually, for me, this has been really informative, because when we're writing proposals,
yes,
we just tend to think of, when we are thinking of stakeholders we want to engage, we
yes,
just list stakeholders that we feel we want to work with. But now I've realized that even in developing a proposal, that we need to do this analysis first, to really identify those stakeholders, so that we don't end up implementing and then finding, which we have found on 1 or 2 occasions, where we'll be told that almost at the end that you should have involved this particular stakeholder or something like that. So this is really useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, madam. Thank you. All right. Any other? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Miriam. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, Kingsley.
Okay, Mr. Vincent.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Today's trading has been really insightful, and it has broadened my knowledge. Even though at some point I know of the power and the interest metrics.
Yeah.
But having gone through this session, I now have the readiness, power, interest, and then. But what's it's a bit technical, and then a bit now for the readiness stroke power metrics. Now,
yes,
do we only use it because on this particular one on the screen now, you only give you gave an example with senior managers, middle managers, and then team members.
Yeah.
Can this be applicable to our stakeholders?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's just maybe.
Can we reverse it instead of having the senior managers, maybe probably the project team? Now we have the stakeholders themselves.
Absolutely. So you could have people in the communities. You know, there are some
Exactly.
people who have undue, because of the position they occupy maybe in the community, and they
Yes.
are trying to block you. So you need to begin to think about how can we um, not share much information to these kind of persons, and then how can we
Okay.
increase the power of community members, for instance. So
Mm,
let's say, okay, before now,
mm.
some communities say they have a youth leader, and let's say the youth leader
Yes.
is not cooperating with the
Proactive.
project,
Yes.
and
Exactly.
then you could say, okay, why do we have to pass through a youth leader as a middleman? Can we now maybe
Mm,
have the community members themselves to set cooperatives, for instance, or to form themselves into cluster and elect their own cluster head, instead of us always passing through a
mm,
particular youth leader? So what you're trying to do now is reducing the power of
mm.
that youth leader, and increasing the power of the community members by asking them to maybe form their own groups or clusters that you can work with. So it doesn't really have to be that it has to be maybe in terms of the office. These
Mm.
are tools that you can apply in the communities at the field
Okay.
level. Okay, but
Okay.
by the time you've identified each of the stakeholders that you have on your stakeholder table, you can still use them here in this particular situation by looking at,
Because
yeah.
because why I had to ask this question is we had a project that we ran in a particular community where we had involved women and youths. Now, so
Yes,
much happened in that community because it was a conflict community. There was a conflict in the community, and most of the people had to leave the community. So, in the course of selecting the stakeholders, we had selected the youths. But at the middle of the project, we now discovered that the the youth leader of the community that resides in the community was not part of the selected youths.
yeah,
Rather, we discovered that it was in the course of the after the selection, and it was in the course of the selection that the people that were selected now selected a somebody as the youth leader.
yeah,
So there was a bit of conflict for us to manage between the true or the youth leader that the community recognizes, and then a youth leader that was recognized on the project. There were two conflicting positions. So what we had to do was to co-opt the community youth leader that is also residing in the community into the project, so that we could have a free flow of and then also for members on the project, because we in the process of our evaluation we discovered that there was a break in communication.
yeah.
And it was as a result of the person who was nominated or elected as the youth leader on the project not being in the community that made it a problem for us. So that's why I had to just ask this question so that I
Okay.
could get more
Okay,
insight.
Kingsley. Now,
Thank you very much.
yeah. So one of the things that we have to remember is that these are participatory tools for stakeholder engagement to be effective. It is not something that you sit in your office and do. So as much as possible, we have to involve community people or the stakeholders themselves. We have to have, in terms of identifying the stakeholders, you may not know all the stakeholders in that particular state. For some of you are working in states, so you may not know. So you need to have like a meeting, at the very beginning, inviting all the groups, inviting everybody as much as you can. And we thank one of the things that the good things about the pandemic is the acceptance of channels such as Zoom and Meet and Microsoft Teams and the others. So you could bring people either in a virtual setting or in a physical setting where you're actually communicating with them and asking them to help you in identifying the stakeholders. And you don't, just because you've identified the stakeholders, you still need to have a process of vetting and verifying, are these the real stakeholders, so that you don't come to a situation whereby you're implementing and the people that you've identified are not the right persons, just like this example that Kingsley shared. So it's critical that you involve. It's about, these tools are just there to help you to identify. the next phase that we are going with the training is, how do you actually engage them? Okay, so how do you consult with your stakeholders? These are just tools that will help you to identify your stakeholders, to analyze their interests. Now that you've known their interests, now that you've known their powers, how do you identify or how would you consult with that particular group? How would you work with them? How would you ensure that if they are blocking, how do you ensure that they are supporters? If they cannot be your supporters, how do you mitigate those risks? Okay, if somebody is not supporting you and you've tried and the person is not supporting you, there's nothing you can do but to begin to brace up to say, okay, what are the potential impact of this lack of support that we're getting from them? And you also need to know that government is a critical stakeholder. Even though we are in the development sector, we cannot work in isolation of government. And we need to begin to think about strategies that will begin to see government as a critical stakeholder and not as an enemy. Because that's the mindset that people within the government circles have, is that civil society is anti-government, they're always opposing. And I think this is because there's been that gap in terms of communication and them getting to know how civil society works and how we work and how they also work. Okay, there are questions on the chat, so I'll just try and read them up and answer and I'll just move on from this and then wrap up the training. So, okay, somebody says, on reducing the influence and power of the influencer, is it allowed because that means meddling in the structure of the organization, thereby causing more harm, maybe due to the influence being asserted? How do we determine? There are two questions. Okay, so I'm not saying that you should I'm not saying that you should go and distort or pull down existing structures in organizations or in communities. But I'm saying that now, if you look at this example I gave, I said this is a competitor, so it may be somebody who is against your project. If somebody is competing with you, it means that person obviously is blocking your moves and is not collaborating. So I'm saying that's why I deliberately used a competing middle manager. It was deliberate. So it means that person is not within your project and that person is always trying to maybe pull your activities down. So how do you ensure that the people do not exert such powers within that particular project that you're working on? That's why I gave that example. Now, so please, I'm not saying let's go and pull down structures that we have, go and disobey hierarchy. That's not what I meant. And the example could still be tilted to be in the communities where we find ourselves. There are people who are not participating, and then there are, blockers. So in every stakeholder, you have blockers. And yeah, Mr. Juroke, you can go ahead, please.
I just want to share an experience we had.
Okay.
We were working with National Council of Women Societies in the Southeast.
Yes.
On a project that affected women. While we were identifying stakeholders, one of the key stakeholders that we identified was the mother of the governor in that state.
Yes.
She was one of the key stakeholders. But while we were analyzing the stakeholders, we agreed that involving her too much might derail the project.
Yeah.
Might make the project more political than what we wanted.
Yeah.
So what we did was to identify those key government, other key government stakeholders, relate with them more in implementing the project, while we related with the mother of the governor less, and empowered the president of the National Council in that state to own the project, rather than allowing the mother of the governor to own the project. Because if we had allowed her to own the project, she would have derailed that project. Her support would have derailed that project. So that was the strategy that we used.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing. Now, you see, these are examples of how people have been used to either reduce influence or increase influence. So just by using these templates on their own, they don't carry out the actions. They just guide you. They help you to know. And like somebody has said in the chat here, sorry. Like somebody has said in the chat here, stakeholders' interests do change with time. So these documents have to be updated. And at different stages of the project, stakeholders' interests may be different, and you may now have new stakeholders coming in. Some stakeholders that you thought were there at the initial stage may no longer be there, especially maybe with government agencies where they have like a life cycle or a high turnover. Government is always transferring. Elected officials have a 4-year cycle or a 3-year cycle if you're in the local government and so on. So with that, you know that, okay, new set of stakeholders are going to come and they may have a different interest and their interests are going to change as well. So what these templates or this stage of stakeholder engagement does is not the real engagement itself per se. It's for you to first of all identify the stakeholders, and then you will now need to develop strategies on, you get to know what their interests are, and then the next thing that you want to move to is the stakeholder engagement proper, which is step 2 on the 8 components that I listed out earlier. I listed 8 components for a proper stakeholder engagement. And I said the first component is that you need to do stakeholder identification and analysis, which is what we are doing now. And the next stage is that you're going to carry out information disclosure. It's a strategy. You're going to carry out stakeholder consultation. You're going to carry out negotiation and partnerships. You're going to carry out grievance management, stakeholder involvement in project monitoring. You're going to ensuring that you're reporting to stakeholders, and you're going to have management functions. I believe that if you cover these 8 and you have those strategies, you're going to have a robust stakeholder engagement in your projects, irrespective of what life or what stage your projects are, whether you're already implementing or you're evaluating. If you complete these 8 components and you build it into your engagement and management strategy, you will never have challenges with managing stakeholders in your projects. You find out ways that you can help deal with the issues that stakeholders bring. So we'll be talking about negotiation. We'll also be talking about how to consult. Would you consult with a stakeholder? So, but unfortunately, it's already 1 o'clock. So I think it's best. I don't want to stretch and abuse the privilege of your time. So I think that we should just pause here end the training here today. And then next Saturday, we're just going to go dive through the other components where we talk about the real engagement itself. How would you share information? How would you carry out a consultation? How would you carry out negotiation? How would you manage grievances within your project and within stakeholders? And how would you conduct stakeholder monitoring? So I really want to appreciate every one of us for your time. I truly appreciate your time, for taking out the time to be here today, and for always joining and for inviting people to join. I just want to encourage everyone to just keep sharing the links or the flyers with your staff, your colleagues, your friends, the people that you know that should be here. And if there are topics that you want us to treat after treating the stakeholder engagement, you can just type it. If there are issues within your organization you would like us to deal with, if there are topics, you can just share topics, propose topics, and would get them out, please. So I really want to appreciate everyone. Do have a lovely, lovely weekend. And thank you so much for always being here. And thank you and God bless.